Bien, buenos días, amigos y amigas, compañeras y compañeros. Este viernes 15 de mayo es un día importante en nuestra facultad. Habría muchos motivos para decir por qué este día es importante, pero para nosotros en nuestra facultad y en nuestra universidad es importante por tener con nosotros al profesor James Clifford, que es sin duda un autor, pensador, antropólogo de referencia a nivel mundial. Por lo tanto, que hoy esté aquí con nosotros para poder dialogar con él, para seguir la entrevista que le hará nuestro compañero y amigo, el profesor Juan Gamella, pues sin duda es un motivo de enorme satisfacción para esta facultad. Este acto se inscribe en el ciclo que venimos desarrollando de mucho tiempo atrás, ya por tanto con mucha solera, el intelectual y su memoria. Y sin duda en este, como en otros casos, pues vamos a tener un testimonio que quedará grabado a disposición de toda la comunidad académica y más allá de lo que va a ser este acto, en el que vamos a entrar en profundidad en la trayectoria humana, académica, intelectual, de lo que supone la obra de James Clifford, su pensamiento, todo lo que es su aportación a la antropología cultural en nuestra época, y no solo a la antropología cultural, sino a muchas más disciplinas. Obras como Dilemas de la cultura o Itinerarios transculturales, o sus trabajos, por citar algunos, sobre historia de la antropología o una antropología posmoderna, pues sin duda son obras de referencia de una importancia que nunca valoraríamos de más. Justamente la obra de James Clifford pues atiende a eso, al pensamiento, a la actividad investigadora, al trabajo de campo que se hace desde la antropología cultural en este tiempo que hemos llamado posmodernidad, es decir, de crisis de la modernidad. Esa crisis de la modernidad que es crisis del sujeto moderno que se pensó en Occidente, de la razón, de la idea o mitología del progreso. Esa crisis de la modernidad con la cual tiene algo que ver, o mucho, incluso la crisis económica actual con sus consecuencias sociales y sus repercusiones políticas en un mundo globalizado y no solo, por tanto, en nuestro estado, en nuestro país. Pues bien, en ese contexto de crisis de la modernidad, lo que llamamos hace décadas posmodernidad, los saberes naturalmente se ven afectados por todas las cuestiones y motivos que los ponen en cuestión. Esos saberes que generamos nosotros mismos, en especial desde el ámbito universitario, y que generamos acerca de nosotros mismos y de nuestras culturas. Y sin duda ese ha sido un motivo fundamental de atención por parte del profesor James Clifford. Y él pues, nos ha dado pistas, nos sigue dando aportaciones, nos sigue dando hilos conductores para movernos en estos tiempos de mezcolanzas culturales, de hibridaciones, de procesos muy fluidos, de procesos de cambio que afectan a cómo vemos nosotros mismos a los otros, a cómo nos ven los demás a nosotros mismos, procesos que obligan a cambiar nuestras miradas, nuestras maneras de generar conocimiento, de escribir, de describirnos, en fin, de todo ello vamos a hablar a continuación. Hay una fórmula, una formulación que plasmó por escrito el profesor Clifford hace tiempo y que resulta muy expresiva. La pregunta ya muchas veces clave no es de dónde es o dónde está usted, sino entre dónde y dónde está en este mundo de cambios, de trasiegos, de fluidificaciones, lo que algunos llaman, bueno, pues esos estados líquidos en los que nos desenvolvemos con muchas preguntas y buscando nuevas respuestas. Sin duda vamos a profundizar y a poder disfrutar de las respuestas que nos va a dar el profesor James Clifford. Agradezco al profesor Gamella la iniciativa de este acto y a través de él al Departamento de Antropología Cultural de nuestra facultad, de una actividad intensa, como bien sabemos y disfrutamos, y además pues agradecemos también a nuestra vicedecana Ana Gallego del impulso que da a todas estas actividades que llevamos a cabo, a iniciativas de unos, de otros, de otras, y que sin duda enriquecen en esta casa, en fin, con la vitalidad académica, humana, a veces hasta lúdica que tiene. Por lo tanto, muchas gracias a todos y disfrutemos del acto. Bienvenido, profesor Clifford, y tienes la palabra para presentarlo e iniciar la entrevista, compañero Juan Gamella.
Buenos días. Gracias por venir. Primero de todo, quiero agradecer al equipo de Canal y especialmente a Ana Gallego el que haya hecho posible este acto. Ana es, como sabéis, una experta en literatura, pero también estudió antropología. Así que su especialidad es muy adecuada con el invitado que tenemos hoy, que ha hecho un enorme esfuerzo para estar aquí porque el motivo de su visita a España es familiar. Y no pensaba en absoluto que le íbamos a meter en un tinglado como este. Y de hecho espero que no aparezcan familiares suyos fuertemente armados en cualquier momento y se lo lleven. Pero bueno, yo creo que James Clifford no necesita mucha introducción para los estudiosos de la antropología y en general de las humanidades. Pero bueno, recordar que es un autor profundamente interdisciplinario, no solo que lo pretenda, sino que lo es. De formación primeras es sobre todo un historiador, pero es un historiador peculiar por el objeto que ha estudiado y por la manera de enfocarlo. Sus intereses cubren muchas áreas que son muy relevantes para una facultad como esta. De hecho, él está un poco sorprendido de que los antropólogos, los filósofos, los historiadores, los filólogos estén juntos. Yo le he dicho que, bueno, que la proximidad física no siempre va acompañada de una verdadera fluidez y colaboración, pero que sí, que estamos todos juntos aquí, que eso es una tradición muy española y muy europea. James se crió en Nueva York y en Vermont y después hizo su doctorado en Harvard. Nos va a hablar un poco de esto. En unos años de gran hegemonía norteamericana, estamos hablando de los años 60, pero también de crisis. Él era un joven en el año 68 y asistió a la gran rebelión que ocurrió entonces. Incluso alguna vez le he preguntado que si tuvo miedo de ser reclutado para ir a Vietnam, ¿no? Y cómo han cambiado tanto las cosas tan deprisa. De hecho, yo creo que él en este momento es un superviviente de su propio éxito, en gran medida, ¿no? Y de la hegemonía que su propio trabajo ha creado. Como la mayoría de vosotros sabéis, él se orientó hacia la antropología francesa y en Francia le deben adorar, porque ya sabéis cómo son los franceses, es algo que debe de contarnos. E incluso volvió a poner de moda y sobre el tapete algunos autores que estaban muy olvidados. Por ejemplo, antropólogos surrealistas, como Michel Leiry y otros, ¿no? Griol, etcétera, Griol. Pero su obra central, su primer trabajo para su tesis doctoral, fue sobre un misionero y además antropólogo y protestante, Maurice Linhart. Y yo creo, el libro anda por aquí, que ese libro es uno de los más sólidos que se han hecho en historia de la antropología. Y yo creo que él está bastante de acuerdo, aunque no tuvo ni ha tenido nunca la resonancia que han tenido los demás. A Clifford le gusta mucho estudiar las cosas desde fuera, o sea, no lo que los antropólogos creen que son, sino vamos a verlos un poco desde fuera por aquello que no quieren ser. Y obviamente los antropólogos no quieren ser misioneros, no quieren tener nada que ver con los administradores coloniales. Nosotros no estamos aquí para gobernar, y tampoco quieren tener nada que ver con los viajeros. Y Granada es una ciudad que aparece en los relatos de viajes, ¿no? Y sin embargo ha demostrado cómo esas tres áreas de escritura, de pensamiento, de experiencia, en gran manera han enriquecido, han contradicho y han aportado a la antropología. A veces en términos curiosos como los términos políticos, ¿no? Que es una obsesión suya, el poder que se ignora. Algunos de sus libros son clásicos, han transformado nuestra disciplina y no solo la antropología, sino todas las ciencias que escriben, como Writing Culture, que es una edición del año 86 que hizo con Marcus, que sí que es etnógrafo y antropólogo y que tuvo un efecto revolucionario. Nos obligó a mirar realmente lo que hacemos, por qué lo hacemos, en qué circunstancias lo hacemos. Y de alguna manera abrió camino con otros a una visión mucho más crítica de nuestra relación con los sujetos que estudiamos o de qué papel tienen que jugar esos propios sujetos en la representación que se hace de ellos, ¿no? Claro, hablar de poscolonialismo a estas alturas pues resulta ya incluso, no sé, quizá tan obsoleto que empieza a ser nuevo otra vez, ¿no? Es tan tarde que empieza a ser pronto. Y eso es uno de los temas que le interesa. Algunas de sus obras, como Predicament of Culture, Returns, obras sobre viajes que podemos citar, Traveling Theories, Roots, han sido traducidas a 10 o 15 o 20 idiomas. O sea, estamos hablando de una figura verdaderamente mundial, que además él siempre se pasea, tal como le veis, con una gorra. Me parece que te va a traer una pizza. Yo la primera vez que le vi, James no ha podido venir y ha mandado a un amigo. Y lleva, lo curioso es que él siempre ha vivido en un lugar muy peculiar, que es Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz es como si dijéramos la universidad hippie de los Estados Unidos, donde han surgido algunos de los movimientos más transformadores. Por ejemplo, el movimiento ecologista probablemente surgió en esa universidad. Es una zona muy propensa a los terremotos, digámoslo así, intelectuales también, y nunca ha querido moverse de allí, que es algo que nos tiene que explicar, porque obviamente él podía haber ido a cualquier universidad que hubiera querido. No es que sea mala, la Universidad de California de Santa Cruz es un campus magnífico, el lugar es extraordinario, es un bosque de secuoyas mirando a la bahía de Monterrey, o sea que quizás es más sabio de lo que parece. Pero está un poco fuera del centro de los grandes circuitos, ¿no?, de Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, y desde ahí han generado un departamento muy especial, el Departamento de Historia de la Conciencia, que cualquiera sabe lo que eso quiere decir, con autoras como Donna Haraway, que conoceréis casi todos, Epstein, de Lauretis, etc., ¿no? Ha sido muy, muy revolucionario. Y una pregunta es en qué horas se encuentra, porque un tema que a él le preocupa mucho es si las humanidades y la antropología estamos realmente retrocediendo. Estamos a la defensiva y estamos perdiendo la batalla, claramente. Y eso es algo de lo que él es muy consciente en este momento y quisiera hablaros. Pero a lo mejor le interesa también hablaros, por ejemplo, de la sequía que está padeciendo California y que demuestra los límites del crecimiento, que ya son visibles en todas partes, el agotamiento ambiental, cómo eso lo están sufriendo especialmente comunidades indígenas, que cada vez están más empobrecidas, o sea, la nueva pobreza que afecta a muchos de los sujetos que fueron centrales para la antropología, ¿no? Y yo con eso me paro, porque creo que entráis en Wikipedia y tenéis un montón de información para los que la queráis sobre la persona que está hoy con nosotros. Él quería decir unas palabras y tenemos un problema que es muy representativo del mundo en que vivimos. Sí, hay una polifonía, pero al final tenemos que traducir al inglés. Y la hegemonía del inglés como idioma no hace sino crecer. Eso también es una de las contradicciones de nuestro tiempo. Entonces yo le voy a entrevistar en inglés, él va a hablar en inglés porque aunque habla muy buen francés, pero español no, porque nunca ha sido su centro de trabajo. Entonces yo no sé cómo hacerlo. En algún momento intentaré, al final de cada pregunta, resumir brevemente lo que yo creo que ha dicho, lo mejor que pueda. Y él quiere decir unas palabras antes de empezar, antes de que empecemos con la batería de preguntas. Así que, Jim, cuando quieras. But it's on, no?
Test.
I think it's working.
Can you hear me? No.
Okay.
Testing. Ahora? Okay. It's good?
No.
Not good. Closer?
No. Use mine.
Well, you're going to need one. Pass it back and forth, I guess. And does this work? Can you hear me?
Yeah. No.
Well, I just speak louder. Louder is the key. Thank you to Juan Gamella and the School of Philosophy and Letters for inviting me. And I apologize to you for not speaking in Spanish. But I assure you, if I tried to do this in Spanish, you would all be running out the door in agony. So I will try not to speak, to be clear as I can be, and hope that communication occurs. The approach of this event is to encourage someone, an intellectual, to remember and to reflect on his own or her own career. And I confess I find this uncomfortable, and at some level I don't really approve of it, at least in public. But and I don't think my own life, personal life, is that interesting. I am an intellectual, and I've lived and worked in the university my whole life, with a few moments out fleeing the draft and opposing the Vietnam War, but that lasted only a short time, and soon I was back in the university studying and getting my PhD. So I'm an academic, but perhaps we can think of me as not as an individual who, but more as a type, some kind of a type who has gone through certain, whose thinking and life in thinking has gone through a series of displacements, as it were, has been traveling in time and space. Over the 30 or 40 years of my career, a lot has changed in the world, and even in the university settings where I worked. And so I'll try to demonstrate at least some of that, and help us think a little bit about how, even if you are not going through dramatic revolutionary shifts in politics, or leaving one part of the world and traveling to another part, you are actually going through displacements. There are processes of relocation and further relocation that go on in our thinking, and that we need to have a language to speak about. So perhaps you can think of me as an example of that. I think that's all I want to say initially. Juan, you want to ask me a question? This is supposed to be an interview.
Una pregunta. ¿Estáis siguiendo lo que va diciendo o necesitáis que yo elabore un poquito lo que ha dicho? No me puedo detener mucho porque si no... Ya, es que no funciona, me parece. ¿Se oye?
Ahora sí.
¿Ahora sí funciona?
Okay.
¿Ahora sí? ¿Se oye? Perfecto, es cuestión de acercarse. Es una cuestión de distancia. La pregunta es, ¿habéis entendido lo que dice? ¿Con este ritmo vamos bien? ¿No hace falta que lo traduzca? ¿No? Ok. ¿Habéis oído que él no está seguro de que este sea un ejercicio adecuado, ni siquiera que lo apruebe hacerlo en público? ¿No? Para una persona, por ejemplo, que estudió tan a fondo los diarios de Malinowski, que fueron una especie de desnudez, es interesante. Bueno, empecemos con las preguntas. You did your PhD at Harvard, and you focused on the history of anthropology. Why did you go into that field?
I think it's important to focus in thinking about myself as an intellectual on my formation as a historian, an intellectual historian, or social and intellectual history was what I studied at Harvard. I'm not a proper anthropologist. My work has had some influence in anthropology, and many people think that I must be an anthropologist. And actually, as the field has changed, and as I have changed over 30 or more years, anthropology is the discipline I feel closest to. But I really am not a disciplinary person. I had the good fortune to teach in a department which has no disciplines, and so I forgot whatever disciplinary formations I might have had. But I never stopped thinking historically, and I think that is an important aspect of my work. The history of anthropology, why did I go into that? Well, why does anyone get their dissertation topic? You know, you get a topic that makes sense at the time, or that your advisor will allow you to do. There are many contingent reasons why one has a dissertation topic, and when you look back on it, sometimes you say, why? But one thing then leads to another. I was very influenced by the British Marxist critic and philosopher, I would say, and literary critic Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams wrote a great book in the 1950s called Culture and Society, which was about the idea of culture, the humanistic idea of culture. And it was a very supple materialist account which put those ideas into the context of industrialization, social change, and the emergence of mass society in England, in Great Britain. And I admired that book because the ideas were part of the social and the economic worlds, but they weren't reduced to those worlds. There was real complexity in the ideas and the traditions that Williams wrote about. And I thought, oh, I wish I could do something like that. And then I realized, well, he had followed the culture idea up through the humanistic vision of culture, Matthew Arnold, etc. But he hadn't done the anthropological idea of culture, which in the 20th century is arguably a more important idea, that idea of culture which as a whole way of life, everyday life, even the most mundane elements are culture. And Raymond Williams had written an important essay in the 50s called Culture is Ordinary, which was a kind of founding document for what would become cultural studies. And all of this, and I thought, well, maybe I could do something like that for anthropology. And if for Williams, the historical context was industrialization, class society, social change in the 19th century, my context would have to be imperialism and colonization and the expansion of the West in the 19th and especially the 20th century. So that's how I got my topic, at least retrospectively explained.
Good. So, you went to Europe to study the history of anthropology, and finally you focused on France. Why France?
Well, I went, many of you are probably, you look like many of you might be putting together some forms of thesis topics of one thing or another, and of one kind or another. And you know that you start out with big ideas, and then at the end you have to narrow it down. You have to. And I had a kind of crazy idea that I would do something, an intellectual history of comparison between the traditions of American anthropology, Boas and company, British anthropology, social anthropology, Malinowski and company, and French anthropology. And French anthropology was the lineage of Durkheim, Mauss, Lévi-Strauss. I didn't know any other names than those three. Well, I got a fellowship, and I went to Paris to start in on the French part, and I found that France was a lot more complicated and interesting than I had thought, and that there were other people, Lévi-Brühl, Marcel Griol, and especially Michel Leiris and the Surrealists, who became very important for me. It became a very rich and multi-voiced tradition. And it's also true, then I went over to England to study to get started on British social anthropology, and I went into the Malinowski archives at LSE, the London School of Economics, and started reading his field notes from the Trobriand Islands. And, the mass of documents was just incredible. And he wrote them in about 5 or 6 different languages. Kyrowinian, the Trobriand language, Polish, he was Polish, French and English, which he knew very, very well. German he also knew very well. There was some Russian in there. I mean, it was insane. So that was discouraging. And anyway, George Stocking, a prominent historian of anthropology, was writing his book on British social anthropology at that very same time. And he was very nice to me, but he made it very clear that he owned this topic. So, for all these reasons, I focused on the French.
Okay. Your doctoral dissertation and your first book was on the missionary and anthropologist Maurice Linhart, who worked in Melanesia, in French Melanesia. And this book seems to be crucial, although it has not had the resonance of your work. Why do you think is that solid? What do you think of that book from the present conjuncture?
I'm glad that you asked this. Most people don't pay any attention to this book. It's a juvenalium, you know.
I love it.
It's a thesis. And a missionary? I had no intention of writing a biography of a missionary anthropologist. Are you kidding? What could be less cool? What could be less sexy than a missionary? But I happened, for a complex set of coincidences, to end up with a bunch of documents from this man's work. And I had never heard of Maurice Lienhard, but he was the French field worker, not as an anthropologist, but as a scientifically minded missionary, and in French New Caledonia. And you may or may not know that New Caledonia was the place where they sent their convicts. They were the Botany Bay. The British sent them to Australia, and the French sent them to New Caledonia, including, by the way, the communards, the surviving radicals from the French Commune of 1871 all went to New Caledonia. It was a very ugly colonial situation. Lienhard was sent there. He was a French Protestant, which makes a difference, French Protestant missionary in 1900, and he spent 25 years there. And he learned Melanesian language really well, not like anthropologists who have only a year or two to learn their native language. He had 25 years. So that put things in perspective for me. And he was he was what was called in those days a indigenophile, or pro-native, agitator, defending his people against a very brutal colonial regime of land expropriation, genocidal disease, and Lienhard looks good. He looks good in that context. And so I was able, what it did for me, which was wonderful, was it gave me a chance to observe a colonial situation in action from inside, through reading his letters, which I had access to. And it also opened up for me Melanesia, the island Pacific, and especially Melanesia, that part of the island Pacific. And that was an enormous gift, and it was entirely by chance. I did not set about to go there or study there, but I grew up in New York City. I was a New Yorker. I thought I was in the center of the world. I was, of course, but that's what I thought too. In New York City in the 50s and growing up, I left the East Coast of the United States. I went to Paris, of course, and then boom, zoom, I leaped back over and I was in southern Melanesia, way down near Australia. And how did that happen? It was a surprise to me. Your thesis can take you strange places if you allow it to. I guess the situation, this would call this la dérive, veering off from, you think you're going here, but you kind of go there. Well, I was open to the island Pacific, which has been enormously enriching, and it also showed me that there were other centers of the world than the North Atlantic. In fact, this is a big secret. The Pacific Ocean is a lot bigger than the Atlantic Ocean. And there are a lot of very dynamic societies around the edge of the Pacific. And even those little dots, the island Pacific, contain 25%, 1/4 of the world's languages. So this is not an empty place or a peripheral place. All this I had to learn because I was located and formed as a North Atlantic person. I went back and forth between New York, where I grew up, and London and Paris. So that was my gift. Through this obscure French missionary, I became, my way of being global, of being located in the global space, changed significantly.
Great. Well, you profile Lienhard as a man that is enmeshed in a colonial, religious, political system that is too strict for him, and he was somehow transcending that world. Also, he was a It was a colonial man in many ways. And you say finally is a liberal, not a radical. It's within hegemony, not counter-hegemony. What about you today?
Oh, well, the word liberal is a very very contested word. A little closer? All right, I'll try. The question of liberal and radical as terms. When I was writing about Maurice Lienhardt, I used them. Lienhardt was what we might call a colonial radical. He was seen at the time as a dangerous advocate of indigenous people. He fought for them. But he did them as a missionary. He also believed in converting the natives, although the conversion for him was a two-way process, not a one-way process. It was a dialogic process. He sometimes would say that he was the one who was most converted rather than they. But that said, he did it from within a Christian formation, from within a Christian worldview, and he never really he never really believed that the French occupation of New Caledonia could end, that there could be an end to colonialism. He was always working from inside the system. He died in 1954, which was, I believe, around the year of Dien Bien Phu, the battle of the Algerian War for the French. Decolonization, the anti-colonial movements in France were just heating up. The Negritude movement, Jean-Paul Sartre, Orphée Noire, Michel Leiris was writing The Ethnographer Facing Colonialism, a great essay. But Lienhardt died then. He was from an earlier epoch. But I was writing from the 1970s, late 70s, so as I look back, I constantly wanted Lienhardt to be more radical than he was. Or I would go and select from everything he did and emphasize what I thought were the radical parts and leave out the parts that were sort of more working within the system, working inside, the liberal parts. So I wrote about that at the end of my book, my dissertation in my book, and I grappled with that feeling of being caught in a system, caught in a hegemony. In an ideological world, which is more than just some ideas, but a whole habitus, a whole series of ways of being, and a common sense. I'm using words like common sense and hegemony, and these are Gramscian words from Antonio Gramsci. The idea of ideology not as something you can refute or step outside of, but more like a common sense, a whole way of being in the world that must be transformed bit by bit, a little bit here, a little bit there. It can't be swept away by the revolution, So writing about this missionary, liberal/radical missionary in a colonial situation allowed me to confront this sense of entanglement. How would you say entanglement in Spanish? Tangled up, enmeshed.
Interconexión, no, pero es más estar involucrado, atado. Yo diría atado.
You get the idea.
Entangled.
Yeah. So, but now you asked about now. For me, the opposition, liberal and radical, seems crude. It seems too heavy-handed. When we made that distinction, I used to make it a lot in the 1970s and 80s. Are you a liberal or a radical? It presupposed usually a more or less Marxist teleology of revolution, of radical transformation. That if you were a radical, you were working for the revolution, something. You were going to sweep away a system. If you were a liberal, you were a reformist, you were making the best of a system. And at worst, you were a comprador, you were a compromiser, you were in fact helping the system by being by being a liberal critic, making it more flexible, and I think that way of thinking, the either-or opposition of liberal versus radical, we have to get rid of and stop thinking that way. We can make these distinctions, but we must recognize that instead of an opposition, it's a continuum, and that there are many positions along that continuum of critique and transgression, and that as we make our critiques and as we try to stand outside of dominant systems, we do it from a very particular place always, and we usually do it from a position that is significantly inside the system, and the idea of the outside critic, the radical critic, which we all in the 60s, not we, but I didn't wear Che Guevara t-shirts and identify with Che, but that was the thinking. Instead of thinking about identifying with being a middle-class American in a particular state educational system and trying to do what I could within that system to make it more democratic, to make it more inclusive, which would be another way of, that would be, oh, he's just a liberal. Well, yeah, but let's suspend for a moment that judgment and think about different sites of struggle. And I'll introduce another Gramscian term, which is the idea of a war of position. Gramsci said that the older Marxist idea of revolution before World War I was the war of maneuver. And that idea, the war of maneuver, was that you make a rapid strike and you capture the state. You capture the palace or the post office or something, and suddenly you have the revolution, like the Bolsheviks did in 1917. A war of maneuver, a war of position, is more like the battlefield of World War I, where there are many fronts, and you're fighting in these trenches, which are elaborate fortifications, and you make small advances here and small advances there. It's not that you're not a revolution. Gramsci was a communist, a devoted communist revolutionary, but for him the revolution would occur in these very specific struggles. And you were always, to use Foucault's term, a specific intellectual, not a general intellectual, but a specific intellectual. You were always situated somewhere, involved in particular fights. And the idea that you could somehow aggregate all those fights into a single fight and roll back the bourgeoisie, or roll back, stop globalization, we might say now, is, this is not a concrete way to think. This is not a realistic way to think. So this will give you an idea, I guess, of where my politics, how I think of the politics of knowledge, and also the sites of activity which have mattered to me, which are the university, which I consider, I teach in a public university, and I consider that a very specific site of struggle. And I'll just finish this little bit by saying, when I went into that university in the 1960s, it was very white. It was predominantly male in graduate school. And there was, I think there was one African who played on a soccer team. But now the university I teach in is extremely multiracial and multicultural. It is majority female, and that goes for the faculty as well as the students. It doesn't yet go for the administration, but we're working on it. The point being, it has not become an ideally multicultural, inclusive, democratic institution. Far from it. But it has changed, and no one would want to go back to the university that I started out in. So I consider that was a war of position. It was a series of particular struggles over hirings and tenures and admissions and all sorts of things. And I consider myself to have been part of that political work. And won't say I'm proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it.
Okay, good. Let's go to writing culture.
Yeah, we're not getting through.
How did it originate? Who was the idea? And did you anticipate the success of that book?
No. For those of you who don't know, Writing Culture was a collection of essays that I co-edited with an anthropologist named George Marcus, and which appeared in 1986, I believe. And it had what the French call a succès de scandale. It was kind of scandalous in its time because it brought into the thinking about anthropology and especially ethnography, the production of fieldwork, it brought theories of writing and theories of rhetoric, and it brought elements from post-structuralist theory into thinking about the production of ethnographic texts and the whole process of representation in anthropology, in ethnography. And perhaps its most profound claim was to reimagine the whole process of ethnography, which had previously been thought of as an anthropologist goes into a society, he or she finds informants. People were called informants. He or she discovers informants, or in fact were often discovered by informants, and out of those relationships, a text emerges that has been authored by the anthropologist. We were interested in how you go from a almost polyphonic or dialogical situation of fieldwork where all sorts of people are talking and listening and so forth. How do you go from that to a book with a single author representing a culture? Well, there are many intermediate steps, and the phrase that was so often used before, writing up, I take field notes in my field work. I go home, I look at my field notes, I write them up and produce the monograph. This is not an adequate way of thinking about the textualizing processes that are there from the very beginning. Because, of course, the informants are not simply passive sources of information, but are active. They're interested in, they're often local intellectuals. Often the anthropologist has not found them. As I said, they have found it. They found the anthropologist, and our ways not only of talking with the anthropologist, but also of controlling the anthropologist, controlling what that person can and can't know, what will be secret, what will be public. In other words, there was a politics and a dialogics, and we used the language of dialogism. We were influenced by Bakhtin, and we tried to make ethnography into a fully dialogical process. And I think that that's had some enduring consequences. It's often said about writing culture that it was all about writing. It tried to reduce anthropology to writing. But from what I've just said, you'll see I'm reacting against that reading. We were interested in writing, but writing for us was a social, interactive, relational process at every stage, from the very first moment when you notice something and make a field note or even make a mental note. That is a textualizing moment. And we influenced by people like Derrida, we would call that writing. Writing doesn't only have to be this. It's modes of inscription. But those modes were relational, social, dialogical. Power was always involved in it. Who is controlling who in these relationships? And it's not only the outsider, the imperialistic anthropologist who's doing the controlling. Often it's happening in practice the other way. The anthropologist is the one under observation in many fieldwork situations. So we were interested in all that. And I think it's had some consequences. Some of the consequences in anthropology, as I follow it now, were the emergence of what's now called collaborative anthropology or even activist anthropology, where the notion that that field work is an encounter in which the two parties collaborate on a common project, not necessarily with the same goal. That is, the indigenous person, if it is an indigenous society, may have certain wishes from the encounter, like to record the language of the elders who are passing away, or to record traditional knowledge, or to make maps of territory in the interests of claiming restitution of lands in land claims trials in court. These are all elements that might be of interest to the indigenous person, whereas the anthropologist might be interested in those, but also be interested in kinship, or what the systems of sexuality, or many in that society, which were not particularly interesting to the indigenous collaborator. But they can work together in a common way and make a kind of contract, and each have their own outcome. But there needs to be that contract, and it needs to be a collaborative relationship that is explicit, not the relationship of the older one of the anthropologist goes out, goes into a community, takes up residence, establishes what was called rapport, which is a kind of friendship or acceptance with people, and then the knowledge flows in. No. Much more social, much more political, much more relational. So I think that now, if anthropology is this way, it's not because of writing culture. No, it's because of decolonization. It's because of these forces that were forces of change that were moving through the places where anthropologists work, in the field and in the university. Decolonization was happening in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and that forced these changes. But writing culture was in some way a reflection or a theorization of some of those displacements, that decentering of the sovereign anthropologist who would go out and talk to people, hang out, and then produce the monograph.
Okay. Predicament. Predicament was your first personal book that was very, very successful. And there you promote the idea of ethnography as serious fiction. That was very liberating for some, and was very mortifying for others. I remember Firth didn't like it very much. How you see that from now? Is still you still see ethnography mostly as a fiction, as a serious fiction?
Did I use that? Well, fiction, as we used it.
Yes, you did.
Well, we used that term, and it came from people like Roland Barthes and folks like that we were reading, and Clifford Geertz, very influential anthropologist of a slightly older generation for us, American anthropologists, talked about anthropology as fiction, but he was very careful to say fictio. The etymology of fiction is something made. It's not something false. It's not something made up. It's not something invented. It's something made. That's all. So fictio, as we used it, and sometimes just we would add the adjective serious fiction just to kind of separate it from the assumption that fiction meant literature, literary fiction. No, serious fiction meant the constructed artifact, a constructed linguistic artifact that tells stories, that tells a story that represents a real world, in that sense. So in that sense, we said ethnography is a fiction. And we were being a little bit scandalous. We were being a little bit, provocative by calling it fiction. And people like Firth, and Raymond Firth was a very mild critic compared to some. There are plenty of people who thought that we were dragging anthropology we were reducing anthropology to literature, mere literature, which was not at all what we were doing. I mean, writing is not literature. Writing is much broader than literature, and writing especially in that expanded sense that we use the term. Yeah, and I won't go into all the reactions of writing culture. There are many people who believed, and some still believe, that this was the moment when anthropology took a wrong turn. This was the bad moment for anthropology, the writing culture moment. If only writing culture had been beaten back, had been defeated, then anthropology would have remained a less it would have escaped its crisis of representation. And my answer to that is, well, the crisis of representation did not come from our book. It came from decolonization, it came from feminism. These are two things that I wrote about in the introduction to writing culture. Feminism pointed out to anthropology that for 50 years or more, since Malinowski, let's say, it had been talking about cultural life, the Trobrianders, the New Air, etc., and it had never paid any serious attention to Trobriand women or to New Air women. And now, you might say, oh, that's an unfortunate oversight, it's an unfortunate mistake. Oh, sorry about that. We left out half the people. Now we'll add them in and everything will be okay. But the fact that women became a topic in women's culture, women's lives, women's bodies, women's subjectivity became a topic in anthropology is a result of feminism, and it's not a result of empirical addition. It's not a result of suddenly noticing something and starting to describe it. There's no way to explain it except politically and historically. So and the same goes for the decentering. The same goes for the perception that anthropology, instead of being a universal science of man, of humanity, was a Western science of man and humanity. That perception is part of the post-war decolonizing moment that we are still feeling the effects of, unevenly, but we are still feeling the effects of that displacement, of that decentering of the West that begins in the years after World War II. It's not that there wasn't critique before that, of course there was, but it wasn't a historical moment in this movement or moment in the same way. The formal independence of all those colonies comes in the 1950s largely, and that's a major change. We can talk about neocolonization and we can talk about globalization and neoliberalism in a minute if you want, but it is not, I think, a simple continuation of imperialism. You can't say imperialism from below, but you can say globalization from below. People often do. It's a common phrase, at least in English, globalization from below. And if you think about all of the social movements that use the internet, very importantly, that'll just be one example for you. I study now tribal societies, indigenous societies, and Facebook is enormously important in Canada, in the US, in indigenous, in the renewal and the continuation of indigenous societies. After all, Facebook is kinship. Kinship meets connectivity. So this is globalization, we might say from below. Even above, below is maybe too simple. From the side, fine. But the changes, the decolonizing changes that I was talking about, and the changes that I connected with feminism, and we could add race and sexuality and a number of other things to our list. These things were not the product of writing culture, and they would have had their effect in anthropology. The crisis in anthropology around representation and power would certainly not have been avoided had writing culture. I think of people had a stake been driven through the heart of writing culture. I translate that if you want.
Okay, you were a
Never
bit
mind.
defensive about that.
Well,
but anyway.
People believe this.
Anyway, let's talk about the present. Let's forget about some of those questions and go. You were telling me before about California drought at the moment and how that shows the limits of technological intervention and how that is that affecting mostly the poor people who in the cities.
Well,
so how you see the present post-colonial or neo-colonial world from Santa Cruz, from the place where
from
you
Santa
live?
Cruz. Oh my God.
Hay una
Well,
sequía tremenda en
But
California.
you'll notice that that Juan said post-colonial and then immediately added neo-colonial, and I think that's exactly right. In my thinking, and these are periodizing terms. You know, we're talking about the post. The prefix post is a periodizing prefix, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's also a supplemental. It has an idea of supplementarity and adding on something more, but post suggests periodization, but it cannot mean we're through with all that. Goodbye to all that. It cannot mean a sharp break between this and colonialism and post-colonialism, modernism, modernity, and post-modernity. No, the neo in post-neo, I often use them together with a hyphen, post-neo-colonialism, because every situation can be looked at either under a post-colonial lens or a neo-colonial lens, and often both at the same time, because everything, however radical, will be commodified. Capitalism and the cultures of late capitalism are extremely mobile, extremely creative, and extremely flexible. So everything will be, if it has value, it will become a commodity. And often one's response to that is, oh well, that's the end of the story. Once things become commodified, it's over. They've lost their radical edge. We're back into the radical liberal divide. And I say, not so fast. Hesitate and wait and see, because commodification is not the end point. It's part of a series of positions, and commodification is not the only thing going on. So we need to kind of bear that in mind when we say post-neo or when we say post-modernity, and also realize that that post-modernity is, in the words of Marxist theorists that I respect, like David Harvey or Frederick Jameson, people like that, post-modernity is very much a new turn or a new phase in a continuous history which involves the development of capitalism from the 19th into the 20th century, and now into a globalizing form of capital. Now, capitalism in the late 19th century was very much a globalizing form. Let's not kid ourselves that globalization is new somehow, but it's taking new forms, and it has new forms of technology and transport supporting it, which I think do make it globalization a different form. And so I live in California now, and have for a long time. Santa Cruz is on the coast just south of San Francisco, right on the Pacific Ocean. California, I live about an hour over some small mountains from Silicon Valley, which is the home of modern media and technology. Okay, so you might say, I'm in a peripheral place in Santa Cruz, but I'm also at the center of something. But of course, and global technologies, the internet, social media and so forth are not centered in a way that, you know, your local newspaper, in a way that the New York Times, when I grew up, was centered. You know, you knew where the New York Times was. Do you know where the internet is? I mean, this is a different, the idea of local and global and positionality or positioning in the system is different and more complicated and very interesting. And I think, you know, it's terrific. There are terrific field sites for anthropology in this brave new world. I live in California near Silicon Valley. I live in Santa Cruz, which is a small town. It's agricultural. Well, it's a university town at one end, and at the other at one end of the county, and at the other end it's agriculture, California agriculture, where they're growing lots of Brussels sprouts and artichokes in vast fields with labor from Mexico and Central America. So I'm part of a series of migrations and circulations moving north and south from Latin America across la Frontera Sur, Frontera Norte, into America and so forth. I'm part of that. I'm also part of Silicon Valley with its sort of thing, with its networks going in God knows how many directions. I'm also increasingly in my own work aware of the survival of native peoples in California. California is a settler colonial state. The serious settlement of California dates only from the 1850s, the gold rush of 1849, when masses of population came to California and overwhelmed the indigenous population. That's not that long ago, and it was a genocidal moment. I use that word advisedly. It was a genocidal moment between the 1850s and 1880s or 90s, and but the native peoples of California have survived and come through, and it's been a dynamic form of survival, an adaptive and a dynamic form of survival that interests me a lot, and they are part of. They also are part of the networks of connectivity that come together in Santa Cruz, where I live. Well, I've mentioned just a few of them, and I don't think that it makes much sense to sum up all of these histories, or sometimes I use the phrase historicities, to sum up all of these historicities in a single story of globalization or progress or the development of capital. And believe me, I pay a great deal of attention to the development of capitalism. I am enough of a Marxist still to really want to pay attention to that, but I can't let that be the only story or the final story. There are these other stories that are more that are less linear, that move in oblique or different directions. So this is where I am. California now is in crisis because the state of California that we know should not exist ecologically. It should not exist because California is dry. It's a dry state. Los Angeles is an enormous city. It was built in a desert. San Francisco, a large city, is on a peninsula. It has no local water source. There's no, where does the water come from? Now, and the San Joaquin Valley, which is in the center of the state, which produces a very high percentage of the agricultural produce for the United States, is also very dry. Juan was reminding me when the Spanish explorers came through, they just called it a desert. Well, California has the Sierra Nevada, which are some tall mountains on the eastern side of the state, and every winter the rains come from the Pacific and they bring snow, and the snow builds up, and glaciers formed in the Sierras, and the snow pack accumulates. And then in the spring and early summer, the snow melts, and it goes down rivers, and over the years, a very elaborate system of reservoirs and canals and irrigation systems and storage that capture this water and bring it to places like Los Angeles, or bring it all the way from the High Sierra to San Francisco. And that's why, this is why the state, we have the state that we have. The only problem is that we are in the 4th year of a bad drought, and the snow accumulation in the Sierra this year is 5% of normal. 5% of normal. So in the spring, right now, and summer, nothing will run into the reservoirs, which are empty. Well, we'll see. Now what will a very powerful class war is about to erupt, has already erupted around who gets the water, right? And not only a class war, but an ecological war, because the rivers need to flow in order for salmon, for example, to live, to spawn. Their indigenous societies are fighting with farmers, and they're fighting with ecologists, and farmers are digging ever deeper. Farmers who can't get their water from the Sierra Nevadas are digging deeper wells if they have the money, but the wells go into an aquifer deep down, and they're depleting that, which is going sinking, and it may not be renewable. But I used to call it bourgeois individualism. Now we would call it neoliberal individualism. Is very strong in the U.S., and the idea is that under my bit of land, I own all the water under there. I can do whatever I want, even though the water, spreads out. And so it's crazy. The state is only beginning to even barely begin to regulate the drilling of these wells. And you do a deep well here, your neighbor has a shallower well, and his well goes dry. Of course, the poor people live in the towns with the small wells, right? Their wells are going dry, while the richer agricultural business people are digging the deep wells. This kind of fights, or the fights between the Indians and the ecologists against the farmers for the use of water from the rivers, for example. Many, many struggles, and money is a big part of it, and we will see, now we will really see the strains on the successful politics, anti-governmental politics that the right wing and the neoliberal hegemony has instantiated in the U.S., which is enormous suspicion of anything public and the privatization of everything. Well, you cannot privatize this water problem. There will be big struggles. What is the moral of all this? I don't know, except the moral of it is, and as I guess it's true of most of what I've been saying today, is that the world that you take for granted is not permanent. It will change, and sometimes change extremely rapidly and dramatically. The decolonization I've talked about, the feminism I've talked about, for many people was very confusing and very troubling, and led to a lot of resistance and a lot of hostility and a lot of confusion. And we're now facing, not only in the California drought, but worldwide, an ecological crisis, a long-term ecological crisis that is going to challenge all of us to think more than locally, regionally, and globally in ways that we do not have the political structures or the ideological structures to do. I do not look, I think the future is going to be very interesting. And you remember there's a famous Chinese curse, or supposedly a Chinese curse, called "May you live in interesting times." Well, I think that as you ask, when I stand here after, you know, I've given you some account of the changes that have occurred during my own intellectual career. As I stand here now, looking at the drought in California, looking at the global warming and the global ecological crisis and the famines that will be coming for sure if population growth continues at its current pace. This is a world that is not something that I grew up with, or that I could even have imagined. And I grew up in a bubble. I grew up in a kind of protected space of first world security, I think, that is gone now. I feel that, and I feel it viscerally, in a way. It's not an intellectual thing. Now it's visceral. I worry about my grandson. I have a grandson, so I have to worry about what things will be like 50 years from now. And it's I'm interested, but I'm also afraid. But I don't want to leave you with just that. I mean,
okay.
I mean, shall we leave them with that?
No. No, it's too depressing. Bueno, lo que ha dicho es muy interesante, aunque a algunos quizá os esté costando entenderlo. Recordar una cosa, que la grabación se va a guardar y luego la podéis ver y repasar y aprender un poco de inglés también. Lo que ha dicho tiene extraordinarias consecuencias respecto a la terrible sequía que lleva 4 años en California y está produciendo que las reservas de nieve en las sierras sean un 5% de lo que han solido ser en los últimos años, con lo que se está produciendo una lucha terrible por el agua entre los diversos usos que California hace. California es un estado muy artificial, como una gran parte de todo el oeste americano, donde el agua es el factor limitante junto con el petróleo. Entonces, si se usa para la agricultura, que es la más productiva del mundo, pues no queda para las ciudades, y hay un individualismo insostenible, que la gente piensa que todo lo que está bajo su tierra es suyo. Están penetrando cada vez más y están secando los acuíferos, y una cierta forma de entender la propiedad es insostenible. Y él está claro que vamos hacia una situación de enfrentamientos como no hemos conocido hasta ahora, porque van a ser globales y van a ser por recursos, como los alimentos, como el agua, como el espacio. Cuando el mar suba, él es muy consciente de que eso está cambiando. Algunos de nuestros viejos ideas, como poscolonialismo, probablemente cobren unas dimensiones insospechadas, ¿no? Y por un lado dice que eso es muy interesante, pero el proverbio chino aquel que decía Dios, no me hagas vivir en tiempos interesantes, pues se aplica sobre todo a su nieto, del que está preocupado. Así que, pero no quiere dejarnos con esto, así que vamos a ir a otro tema. Let's talk a bit about heritage politics. Granada is a place that has captivated travelers, and you have Alhambra theaters all over the world, and you're very interested in museums, collections, traveling. Any comment on that from being here, or is such a change of mood from when you were just a minute ago?
Well, I'll be very brief, because I'm not going to talk to you about, you know, heritage politics in Andalusia, and well, one idea that struck me in thinking about the Alhambra was this. I mean, the Alhambra is a heritage site now. You know, it's been identified by UNESCO. It is visited by countless tourists. Its profile is recognizable everywhere, on T-shirts, on handbags, on refrigerator magnets. You know, it's everywhere, right? And in fact, when I came into this room, I said, "Where's the logo Where's the logo? There should be a little Alhambra or something right here. You know, in a lot of universities you'd have that. And all we have is the original logo here behind me, and which it could be stylized, I suppose, simplified to serve as a logo for the universities. And then I looked and saw Garcia Lorca looking at me with that incredible gaze, and thought, well, here we are between the state and subversion, you know, and we're in here in between. We can't escape. We certainly, yeah. These define our space in some way. Well, the Alhambra as logo, the Alhambra as heritage site. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that the Alhambra has been turned into a machine for processing tourists? You know, that it's become a heritage site. Is this good or bad? There are many good things about it. We could be romantics and think about, oh, if only we could have been here with Washington Irving, you know, when it was sort of semi-ruined, and really feel a place, you know. And as tourists, you know, the magical moment for the tourist, the miracle moment for the tourist is to be in the court of the lions or by yourself. You know, somehow everyone else, maybe you get in early, to be there alone with it, that's the magical moment, you know. But forget it, this is nostalgia in the bad sense. We're not going back to that. Heritage is happening, the heritageization of things is happening. And I guess this is, for me, this is the good news, bad news.
This is the magical moment.
Great. This is very Dada. I love it.
Oh no, I think it's not. It's probably an attack.
It's great.
It's an attack from the Muslim reaction. So much. It's great. Who's doing it?
It's good.
Hola.
The professor is interrupted.
¿Quién ha sido? I hope this goes into the film. It's teaching. It's language.
It's language, but it's Dada. You know, it's broken down to the basic phonemes, you know, sound. Well,
it's Croatian, probably being taught.
Yeah, let's just end it on this moment of surrealist interruption.
Okay, yeah. I think this is a great moment to. Es un momento fantástico para acabar. ¿Nos parece? Nos han cortado. Así que, ¿hay alguien que quiera hacer alguna pregunta o algo que os interese? De todas formas, él está por aquí, o sea que. ¿Hay alguien que quiera preguntar algo? Es que yo creo que nos han puesto el final perfecto, ¿no? El decano corriendo para solucionar. I think it's a right time. Es un momento muy bueno para acabar. Nos lo han puesto fantástico. La interrupción ha sido dadaísta. Recordar que Clifford tiene mucho interés en la escritura surrealista. Y yo creo que si esto queda grabado en la peli va a ser fantástico. Y además la colgamos en internet y podemos repetirlo.
I thought I was in the Café Voltaire with the Dadaists, you know. having speaking invented African languages broken down into their phonemic elements. This is Dada. There's hope.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.